deterrence, meaning that if you cross this red line, you will pay a price that is disproportional, and such a price that you will never want to even consider doing that again.
And I think there is the possibility for a sudden and complete collapse of Ukraine. I'm talking about real chaos.
Counter-terrorist operation, because the Russian government has labeled Zelensky and the Zelensky government as a terrorist organization, a terrorist entity, as terrorists themselves, that sends a message not just to the Ukrainians by inflicting excruciating harm on them, but to the West as well.
They're saying, okay, we're going to take the gloves off, and if you hide it in a highly populated area, we're going to hit it anyway.
That's a dangerous moment. It's a very dangerous moment.
Welcome to another deep dive. We're the place where we, really try to get beneath the surface of these big global events. We dig into a stack of sources, try and pull out those essential nuggets of knowledge.
That's the goal.
And today we're tackling something really critical, something that genuinely impacts global stability and maybe is often misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at Russia's strategic thinking in Ukraine.
Exactly. Understanding Russia's strategic calculus in Ukraine.
And we're deliberately looking at a viewpoint here that really pushes back against the, let's say, the mainstream narrative you often hear.
How so?
Well, we're digging into the argument that Russia's recent escalations aren't just, random violence or some kind of emotional lashing out.
Okay.
The sources we're looking at suggest they're part of a very calculated strategic push to reestablish what Russia calls strategic deterrence.
Strategic deterrence, right. And this is happening because they feel certain lines were crossed.
Exactly. After what they perceive as critical red lines being crossed repeatedly by Ukraine and its Western allies. And we really need to unpack what those red lines actually mean from, their perspective.
Okay, so let's set that up. Our mission for you, listening in, is to really grasp why this particular viewpoint argues the West is fundamentally misreading Russia's motives.
Yeah, the core idea is that Western analysis often frames Russia's actions as, like you said, emotional or reactive, when, according to the sources we've reviewed, they're actually highly strategic. It's all part of a longer-term geopolitical game plan.
And we'll also need to look at the potential for, even more severe actions from Russia, maybe disproportional actions if these red lines keep getting ignored.
That's definitely part of the analysis. And crucially, there's this key geopolitical angle.
Yeah.
Russia's objective, or maybe preference, for a controlled collapse of Ukraine.
Controlled collapse,
Right.
as opposed
to a chaotic one. A chaotic scenario is something Russia, according to this view, really wants to avoid because it could directly pull in NATO countries. Think Poland right next door.
Okay. That difference, controlled versus chaotic, sounds like it has huge implications.
Massive. It really shapes how they might approach the endgame.
All right. So to help us navigate this complex and, let's be honest, pretty uncomfortable territory, we've gathered a really interesting mix of sources.
Yeah, it's quite diverse. We've got analysis from think tanks like CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and ACKS, which tracks humanitarian situations.
We've also looked at UK Parliament documents, some pretty interesting discussions from military and geopolitics forums on Reddit.
Which can offer some, unfiltered perspectives.
Definitely. And also a range of academic papers, proper scholarly work on deterrence theory and Russian foreign policy.
So, taken together, these sources hopefully give us a more, let's say, sobering analytical look at the conflict, pushing us beyond just the headlines.
Getting to the why behind Moscow's decisions. Okay, we've set the stage. Let's dive into Section 1. The Russian strategic framework resetting deterrence and the global order.
Right.
So first off, how does Russia actually see the world stage? What's the core belief driving their foreign policy based on these sources?
It's actually spelled out quite clearly in their official grand strategy documents. Moscow fundamentally believes the whole international system is undergoing a major shift.
A shift away from?
Away from what they see as a Western-centric, U.S.-led unipolar system. One big power calling the shots.
Okay.
And it's moving towards what they term a polycentric world.
Polycentric, meaning multiple centers of power?
Exactly. Power's more equally distributed, more independent centers. And for the Kremlin, this isn't just something that's happening. They see it as inevitable and, crucially, desirable.
Desirable. So they welcome this change.
They do. They genuinely seem to believe this new multipolar setup will ultimately lead to more global stability and, not coincidentally, secure a more prominent role for Russia itself, a leading role, regionally and globally.
That's a powerful self-image, seeing themselves as riding this wave towards a more balanced order. But hang on, if they think the end result is more stable, why are things so incredibly unstable now?
Ah, that's the paradox, isn't it? They see the destination as stable, but the journey, the transition period, that's expected to be, well, messy.
Messy how?
Our sources suggest Russia fully anticipates rising geopolitical instability during this phase, more potential for conflict.
Okay.
And that includes a mixed internal unrest within countries, but also external aggression as the established powers react to their perceived decline.
So they expect resistance, particularly from the West.
Absolutely. The core view is that the West, especially the US, will resist its perceived inevitable decline. And this resistance, in Russia's view, is what creates the friction, the instability.
So things like NATO expansion, they'd see that
as direct proof of the West trying to cling to unipolar dominance. Actions that, from Moscow's perspective, fuel instability rather than calm things down. It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for them, justifying their own assertive moves.
Right. And within this shifting, kind of turbulent landscape, what's Russia's specific game plan for itself? They're clearly not sitting back.
Not at all. Passive is not in the playbook. Russia explicitly aims to consolidate its status as a leading world power.
Okay.
Their official documents, like the 2015 National Security Strategy, talk about maintaining strategic stability and mutually beneficial partnerships in a polycentric world.
And they use everything they've got to achieve that.
Every tool. Their permanent UN Security Council seat, that veto power, is huge. Their large nuclear-capable military, obviously, and their natural resources, especially energy, used as a geopolitical lever.
Right.
It's all geared towards ensuring their voice isn't just heard, but is actually decisive in shaping the global agenda, preventing what they see as others acting unilaterally.
And closer to home, regionally, their focus seems even sharper there, historically very protective of their neighborhood.
Oh, absolutely. That's a core pillar of their strategy.
Yeah.
Establishing and leading the post-Soviet space, what they call the Eurasian region.
The Eurasian Union idea.
Exactly. Putin talked about it back in 2012, creating a bloc that could be one of the poles of the modern world, the sort of bridge between Europe and Asia.
So more than just trade.
Much more. It's explicitly framed as an independent center of global development, with political and security dimensions baked in. It really highlights their intense focus on their immediate neighbors.
Or they haven't hesitated to use force or coercion before.
No, they haven't. Historically, they've used coercion, even military force, to prevent what they perceive as countries defecting to Western-led integration projects.
Like Moldova, perhaps. Not military, but economic pressure.
That's a perfect example. Moldova faced severe economic pressure, trade bans from Russia, specifically when it moved closer to signing a major trade agreement, the DCFTA, with the EU.
Because Russia saw that as
a direct challenge, a move chipping away at their regional dominance. So they responded forcefully, economically, to try and deter that closer Western tie.
That mention of deterrence, even economic, brings us neatly to a really sensitive area.
Yeah.
Nuclear deterrence and signaling.
Right.
This leads to that concept many Western analysts find, frankly, worrying. Escalate to de-escalate. Sounds completely backward. What does that actually mean in their context?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty concerning, because it kind of turns conventional Western deterrence logic on its head.
How so?
Russia's nuclear doctrine, specifically Article 4 of their basic principles, is widely read as enabling this escalate to de-escalate strategy.
Okay.
The text says that in a military conflict, the policy aims to prevent further escalation and end the conflict on terms acceptable for the Russian Federation.
Acceptable for them. So the idea is
right.
Use a nuke to stop the fighting.
Sort of. The interpretation is, if Russia finds itself in a conventional fight where its core interests, or maybe even its ability to keep fighting, are existentially threatened.
Existential threat, key phrase.
Key phrase. Then they might consider a limited, maybe tactical nuclear strike. But the purpose wouldn't be to win a nuclear war.
Right.
It would be to shock the opponent, show absolute resolve, and basically force them to back down, to de-escalate, and end the fight on terms Russia can live with.
So, cornered, potentially losing conventionally, they might use a limited nuclear strike, not to win the whole thing, but to force a favorable end. That's, wow, very different from Cold War Medieval logic.
Fundamentally different. The doctrine seems to allow first use, if there's that existential threat. And that doesn't necessarily mean a nuclear attack on Russia.
Okay.
If they meet those conditions, in their view, and decide to use nuclear weapons, it's with the explicit goal of stopping the conventional fight from getting worse by forcing the other side to fold or negotiate.
It's a massive gamble then, reshaping the battlefield not by winning, but by making the risk unbearable for the opponent.
Exactly. Imposing unacceptable risk and cost to force them to the table.
And we've seen Putin use this rhetoric, haven't we? It's not just some dusty doctrine.
Oh, absolutely not. He's increasingly invoked the nuclear arsenal to pressure the West, specifically over Ukraine support.
Like putting forces on high alert.
Yeah. February 2022, ordering nuclear forces onto a special regime of combat duty. That's heightened alert. Then announcing tests of new delivery systems, like the Sarmat ICBM.
And suspending arms control treaties?
Yes, suspending participation in New START with the U.S. These aren't just random acts. In deterrence theory, these are classic costly signals.
Costly signals, meaning
Actions that clearly raise the risk, show you're willing to bear costs, and therefore make it more costly for your adversary not to take your threat seriously. It's about making the threat credible, avoiding the perception you're just bluffing.
projecting resolve, even if it means cranking up the heat significantly.
That's the idea.
And this ties back to their conventional forces, right? Many sources say they're not on par with NATO's collective strength. How does that gap play into this nuclear thinking?
That's a critical link. The sources suggest Russian military thinkers have, for a long time, anticipated needing asymmetric responses if they ever fought NATO directly.
Asymmetric because
Because they expect to have a weak conventional military hand compared to NATO's combined power.
Okay.
This isn't entirely new thinking either. It echoes old Soviet doctrine where tactical nukes were seen as an equalizer if you were outnumbered conventionally.
If you can't match them tank for tank.
You find another way to impose unacceptable costs or risks that make them think twice. That asymmetry naturally pushes them towards considering non-strategic nukes to level a field or regain the upper hand.
Which brings us to this idea of an escalatory gap, particularly around these non-strategic nuclear weapons, or NSNWs. What exactly is this gap, and how do these specific weapons fit in?
Right, this is a really nuanced and, frankly, quite worrying part of their thinking. Russian military analysts reportedly believe there's a significant gap, a kind of fire break, between using NSNWs, these lower-yield, shorter-range battlefield nukes, and a full-blown strategic nuclear exchange, all-out global nuclear war.
So they think using a small one wouldn't automatically trigger Armageddon.
That seems to be the belief.
Yeah.
A limited use wouldn't necessarily cross that ultimate threshold. And this perceived gap might be getting wider in their minds because of Russian research into and potentially fielding of very low and even ultra-low yield NSNWs.
Jenny nukes, basically.
Extremely low yield.
Yeah.
Combine those with their highly accurate precision-guided munitions, their PGMs,
Sure.
and the sources argue this creates a potent and, in their view, usable tool. Usable for tactical gains without automatically triggering that strategic response.
Usable how? What kind of targets are we talking about? What's the intended effect of such a limited strike?
Well, this combo, low-yield NSNWs plus accurate PGMs, could dramatically increase the number of high-value NATO targets Russia feels it could credibly threaten.
Like military bases, command centers.
Exactly. Critical military infrastructure, airfields, big logistics hubs, command control nodes, maybe even troop concentrations or ammo dumps.
So not cities, but key military assets.
Right. The idea isn't total annihilation, but imposing such severe disruption and cost, maybe with one or two limited nuclear strikes on purely military targets, that it forces the adversary to immediately back down and accept Russia's terms.
It's a way to show overwhelming power and resolve to stop the fighting or force concessions without going all the way to strategic nuclear war.
That's the terrifying logic. It's designed to give them leverage in a conventional fight they might otherwise be losing, a very dangerous edge case in their doctrine.
Chilling, but absolutely vital to understand their strategic framework.
Yeah.
A cold calculation. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Section 2, Russia's industrial and economic resilience fueling a long war.
Right, because this capacity underpins the strategy.
Exactly. Many early Western narratives focused on sanctions crippling Russia, but the sources we've looked at paint a much more resilient picture. How exactly has Russia adapted its defense industry to keep this war going?
It's actually quite striking how quickly they seem to have adapted, or at least claim to. Western assessments about their missile production, for example, were pretty downbeat right after the invasion.
Thinking they'd run out quickly.
Yeah, but those assessments started changing dramatically around September 2023. Russian arms manufacturers began publicly promising a big ramp-up.
Like who? Any specific examples?
Well, JSC Tactical Missiles Corporation, a huge state defense firm, claimed it had doubled precision weapon production. And for some key munitions, they were claiming increases of 3.5 to even 5 times.
Wow. That's a huge jump.
It is. And we saw reports of expansion, extra shifts at places like the Dubna machine building plant, which makes guided missiles.
So specific factories tooling up, working harder. Any other examples of specific weapon systems being ramped up?
Definitely. Kalashnikov, famous for the rifles, but they make other things too, pledged to more than double production of things like Vickers anti-tank missiles, those are air-launched, and Kitilov laser-guided artillery shells.
How? New facilities.
New facilities, investing in automation, really pushing output. And based on observing this activity, Western analysts started estimating that by early 2024, Russia might have built its stockpile of modern Iskander missiles ballistic and cruised back up to around 200. Plus other types like KH-101s.
Okay, so that suggests a significant surge in their ability to make these complex, advanced weapons, directly challenging that early narrative about them running out.
It certainly complicates that narrative.
Now, you mentioned precision-guided munitions, PGMs. There's been a lot of debate about Russia's capabilities there, especially compared to Western tech like JDAMs that turn dumb bomb smart. What do the sources say? Do they have PGMs or not?
It's definitely more nuanced than a simple yes or no.
Yeah.
Some Western sources do emphasize that the U.S. has, essentially unlimited stocks of PGMs through things like those JDAM kits you mentioned.
Right, the conversion kits.
And those sources sometimes question if Russia can really produce similar advanced tech domestically in large numbers, talking about a crippling lack of PGMs.
Okay, a lot.
But other sources point out that Russia does produce its own laser-guided bombs. Things like the KB-1500L, KB-500 pounds, and maybe more significantly, they have systems like Ugroza.
Ugroza? What's that?
It's basically a conversion kit, similar in concept to JDAM, but using laser guidance. It upgrades older, unguided dumb rockets into precision munitions.
Ah, so they have their own way of making dumb munitions smart, even if it's different tech.
Exactly. So while they might struggle to match the sheer scale or maybe the top-end sophistication of some Western PGM production, especially stuff needing advanced microchips which are sanctioned,
right,
it's clear they are producing and using their own types of precision systems. So the idea that they have a complete total lack isn't quite right. It's more about the type and scale of their PGM capabilities.
That makes sense. Not zero PGMs, but maybe a different mix, perhaps relying more on upgrading older stocks. Important difference. Okay, beyond just making weapons, how has Russia actually managed to get around all those Western sanctions and shift its economic alliances to keep the war effort funded? That seems crucial to their resilience.
It really is a story of pretty rapid economic adaptation and geopolitical reshuffling. The sources show a dramatic change in where Russia gets key military imports, especially microelectronics.
Which are vital for modern weapons.
Absolutely. Before the full invasion in March 2022, they relied a lot on Western suppliers. Now, the data shows nearly all the top exporters of these critical parts are based in China and Hong Kong, plus one notable player in Turkey.
So a massive pivot eastwards, essentially.
A clear, rapid reorientation of their entire supply chain, moving away from the West, cementing new partnerships.
And there are signs this new network isn't exactly transparent, right? Maybe deliberately hidden?
That's what the data strongly suggests. CSIS analysis, for instance, found that many of the biggest importers of these electronic goods into Russia only popped up after the partial mobilization started in September 2022.
Ah, so new companies appearing right when they needed them most.
Exactly. The timing is highly suspicious. It strongly suggests these aren't old established firms, but are likely shell companies, set up specifically to bypass sanctions and hide where the goods are really coming from.
A sophisticated workaround strategy.
Deliberate and sophisticated, yes. Makes it incredibly hard for Western authorities to track and stop these flows.
And China's role in all this seems absolutely central, not just as a supplier, but maybe as a deeper strategic partner.
Pivotal. Maybe the single most important factor in Russia's economic staying power right now. Putin's been very open about wanting more high-tech cooperation with Beijing.
Like what?
Everything from joint microchip factories inside Russia to working together on space assets, satellites that could have military uses.
Yeah.
China's role as a defense and security partner has, according to the sources, increased dramatically. They're providing vital equipment and technologies, sometimes directly, sometimes maybe through intermediaries.
Which allows Russia to
to keep fighting what everyone now admits is a long war of attrition. Without China stepping in like this, Russia's economic and military situation would likely be far, far worse.
Which raises a really interesting, maybe awkward point about the sanctions themselves, a kind of dilemma.
It really does. One fascinating complexity highlighted in the sources is that some of the exact same Chinese and Hong Kong companies supplying Russia's military are also apparently supplying Ukrainian firms that work with the Ukrainian military.
No way, really?
Yeah, it points to this potential dilemma in the sanctions strategy. Global supply chains are so tangled that the entities helping one side might be indirectly linked to the other.
That just shows how hard it is to truly isolate a major economy in today's world. Sanctions aren't a magic bullet.
Not airtight, no. They have impact, definitely, but they also create these weird, unforeseen complications.
So, looking beyond just military stuff, how has Russia's broader economy adapted? You mentioned Russification earlier, but also this wider shift.
That's a good summary. Russia's big response to the Western sanctions was twofold. First, rely more on domestic resources. That's the Russification part, investing in making things at home they used to import.
Okay.
And second, pursuing a more multi-directional foreign economic policy, basically consciously building closer ties with non-Western countries.
So, specific examples.
More investment in domestic oil and gas equipment to replace Western tech, a big increase in imports from Asian countries, not just China, but others too, and more non-Western money flowing in, with China leading the way in funding Russian energy projects, for example.
So they're actively rebuilding their economic network, just facing different directions.
Exactly. Less reliance on traditional Western partners.
And what's the net effect on the Russian economy overall, and crucially on public opinion inside Russia? Have the sanctions created the kind of internal pressure the West hoped for?
Well, from the Kremlin's viewpoint, these policies have largely worked in cushioning the blow. They've managed to lessen the severe external economic and political pressure.
Okay.
And this seems reflected in public opinion. Our sources suggest the Russian public generally sees the war as a justified response to the outside threat, often framed as defense against NATO.
And support levels?
Support for the war itself has stayed remarkably stable, somewhere in the 70–75% range in some independent polls. That indicates a fair amount of internal cohesion.
Which contrasts sharply with Ukraine's situation.
Right. Ukraine is heavily dependent on Western aid, and if that wavers, their ability to fight is directly threatened. Russia likely sees this contrast as tilting the attritional balance in their favor over time.
It suggests the Kremlin has managed to frame the narrative internally pretty effectively, maintaining support despite the costs.
Largely, yes. Garnering continued public backing, even with a human and economic toll.
That's a sobering picture of Russian resilience and a deeply embedded worldview. Okay, this takes us straight into Section 3, crossing red lines, escalation, and disproportionality.
Right, those red lines we mentioned at the start.
Exactly. The idea is central to their strategy, apparently. But how do our sources actually define what Russia sees as these critical boundaries? The ones that, if crossed, demand escalation.
This is where that core argument about Western miscalculation comes in strongest. The sources clearly suggest Russian policymakers might feel stimulated to try to reabsorb Ukraine out of their own defensive impulses
If what?
If what they see as near-term NATO expansion is accompanied by energetic military preparations viewed as unprovoked.
So it's not just NATO membership on paper, but actual military buildup near their borders.
Exactly. It links back to that whole long, contentious history of NATO's eastward expansion. From Moscow's viewpoint, a hostile military alliance getting closer, doing exercises, feels like a direct existential threat.
That deep-seated fear of encirclement.
Yes. Historical vulnerability, wanting a buffer zone.
Yeah.
Each step NATO takes east is seen as a deliberate squeeze on what they consider their vital security space.
And Ukraine's own internal politics, its national identity, seems to play a role in how the West engages, right? Is Russia aware of this or trying to exploit it?
Oh, definitely. It's subtle but important. The sources note that Ukraine's dominant form of nationalism is civic, meaning it's based on citizenship, anyone can belong, and crucially, ethnic Russians aren't officially persecuted. This civic model is congenial to the West. It fits with liberal democratic values.
Which makes it easier for the West to support Ukraine, frame it as defending democracy.
Precisely. It smooths the path for military and financial aid. But the sources warn if Ukraine were to shift towards a more explicitly ethnic nationalism, one that prioritizes ethnic Ukrainians, maybe marginalizes minorities.
Then what?
That could change the dynamic. It might complicate Western support by muddying that narrative of a purely inclusive democratic Ukraine under attack.
And Russia often tries to paint Ukrainian nationalism as inherently ethnic, right? To undermine that support.
That's a standard part of their information campaign, yes, trying to erode Western solidarity.
Okay, so we've got the strategic intent, the industrial capacity. Let's look at the actual escalation on the ground from what they called a special military operation to, well, what's clearly now a full-scale war. How did that shift happen, practically speaking?
The signs were there quite early, actually, showing their long-term commitment. By July 2022, just months in, sources say the Kremlin was explicitly preparing the Russian economy for special measures due to war in Ukraine.
Special measures, like war economy footing?
Exactly. The Russian parliament passed the first vote on war economy measures. That was a clear signal. This wasn't just a limited special military operation anymore. It was war, requiring full economic mobilization.
Giving the government powers to direct industry.
Yes, compelling businesses to produce military goods, shifting priorities. And while the military mobilization that September was messy at first, lots of issues. Draft dodgers.
Right, we saw those reports.
It has continued.
Yeah.
They've kept increasing forces, recruiting prisoners, contract soldiers. This sustained effort, plus the economic shift, shows they're dug in for the long haul.
And alongside that mobilization, we've seen this disturbing pattern of targeting. Sources talk about an ongoing strike campaign hitting civilian areas and infrastructure much more, especially since mid-2024. That seems deliberate.
It does seem calculated, and
Yeah.
the details are chilling. It looks like an effort to inflict broad societal pain.
Examples.
Things like drone strikes hitting grocery stores, forcing closures, pushing people into dangerous red zones just to get food, targeting buses, injuring drivers, wrecking vehicles, disrupting basic transport.
And healthcare too.
Yes, direct impacts. Reports of medical staff hurt, patient cars targeted near hospitals, even hitting backup generators at cancer centers. These aren't military targets in any conventional sense.
Well, no.
They directly hit civilian access to essentials, creating extreme hardship. It looks like a strategy to degrade quality of life, break morale, weaken Ukrainian society's resilience.
And it's not just civilian infrastructure, is it? They're hitting Ukraine's defense industry at the same time.
Correct. Alongside these attacks on civilian life, the strikes also hit Ukraine's defense industrial base, the DIB. Factories making or repairing weapons,
Yeah.
ammo.
It's a double blow.
Exactly. Hitting civilian life and military production. Which just highlights how critical air support and better air defenses are for Ukraine. If their own industry is constantly degraded, they become even more reliant on outside aid. It's a strategic way to wear them down.
This kind of targeting, especially the civilian impact, really bumps up against international law, doesn't it? The principle of distinction. How do these actions fit or not fit within that legal framework?
It's a fundamental issue in international humanitarian law, yes. The principle of distinction absolutely forbids direct attacks on civilians.
But attacks on military targets are allowed, even if civilians get hurt incidentally.
Yes, proportionate attacks on military objectives are permitted, even with foreseen incidental civilian harm. But, and this is crucial, a war crime occurs if there's an intentional attack aimed directly at civilians. That's totally forbidden.
Okay.
Or, if an attack is launched on a military target, knowing that the incidental civilian harm would be clearly excessive compared to the expected military gain.
Clearly excessive, that's the threshold.
That's the proportionality test.
Yeah.
And the pattern of strikes we're talking about, hitting essential services, places with no obvious military value, seemingly designed to terrorize. It certainly raises serious questions. Are these disproportional? Are they even intentional attacks on civilians? Both would be war crimes. It suggests a strategy that might deliberately flout those laws to break the enemy's will.
A grim reminder of the human cost and the serious legal questions hanging over this conflict. Okay, let's move to the final section, Section 4. The geopolitical game controlled versus chaotic collapse.
This really gets to the heart of Russia's potential endgame.
Right. But first, to even talk about collapse, we need to understand the pressure Ukraine is under. What's the state of their economy and the humanitarian situation?
It's incredibly tough. Ukraine's central budget has ballooned since early 2022, mostly because defense spending is just astronomical now.
Consuming a huge chunk of their resources.
Huge. And while foreign aid, mostly Europe and the US, covered about 75% of their budget deficit in 2024.
Which is massive dependency.
Massive. The future of that aid is unclear given political dynamics in those donor countries. Elections, shifting priorities in the West, it makes Ukraine extremely vulnerable. Any drop in aid could be catastrophic for funding the government, let alone the war effort.
And inflation is biting again too, right? After getting better for a bit.
Yes, unfortunately. Inflation dropped in 2023, but started climbing again mid-2024, partly due to food costs, low harvests because of the war, partly energy costs, those Russian attacks on infrastructure.
And labor shortages.
And labor shortages, yes. Mobilization, displacement, it all pushes up wages and slows recovery. It's a combination punch hitting the economy and ordinary people very hard.
And beyond the big economic numbers, what about the humanitarian side? All those internally displaced people, the IDPs, what's the strain on cities, on services?
It's a huge ongoing crisis. Cities like Dnipro, Izium, Kharkiv are under moderate strain, trying to cope. Limited resources struggling to handle new arrivals needing housing, healthcare, social support.
And these aren't just short-term refugees.
No, many are long-term displaced. They've lost everything. Vulnerable groups have specialized needs, trauma care, physical rehab, often hard to meet. Plus, getting aid to people is tough. Ukrainian authorities restrict access near the front lines for safety.
Increasing costs for aid groups.
Right, in Russian-occupied areas, basically inaccessible for international aid. Millions are cut off.
And all this displacement and stress must be creating social tensions too, within communities.
Absolutely. It's complex.
Yeah.
Some IDPs are actually returning to frontline areas, not because it's safe, but because they struggle in host communities, finding work, housing.
And they return too.
Often to destruction, fragile ceasefires, immense difficulty rebuilding lives, accessing basic services like mental health support. Markets have shortages. And on top of that, you get social tensions, especially in frontline areas, about who might have collaborated with the Russians during occupation. Adds mistrust to an already traumatized situation.
A picture of a nation stretched almost to breaking point. Okay, let's bring Poland into this geopolitical puzzle, a key regional player. What's their fundamental view of Russia? How does it shape what they do?
For Poland, it's stark. Russia is, almost without exception, seen as the foreign threat. The enemy. It's deeply historical, but also very current.
So no real dialogue.
Virtually none. Deep, profound distrust. And this isn't just rhetoric, it drives everything. Polish military training, weapons buys, it's all judged on effectiveness against Russia. Their entire defense posture is geared towards deterring or fighting Russia. It's a national consensus fueled by history and present dangers.
And Poland's core interests involve its neighbors, right? Ukraine, the Baltics, keeping them independent.
Absolutely vital. Poland sees its key interests as the continued independence of the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and integrating Ukraine, and ideally Belarus too, into the same political and economic sphere as Poland.
Why? What's the strategic goal there?
Two main things. First, push the Russian threat further away, create a deeper buffer zone. Second, increase Poland's own regional clout and security by leading this bloc of states aligned against Russia. For Warsaw, a free, Western-leaning Ukraine and Baltics isn't just nice to have, it's core national security.
Which brings us to that Russian disinformation story, the no-border claim about Poland wanting Western Ukraine. What was that about?
Classic Russian infowar tactic. Spreading messages that Poland secretly plans to annex Western Ukraine. They twisted a comment by President Duda in May 2022.
What did he say?
He said something like, there will no longer be a border between Poland and Ukraine. Contextually, he meant super close cooperation, integration, partnership between two sovereign nations.
But Russia spun it as
Poland's plan to take back territory. Ignoring that Western Ukraine has distinct historical regions, not just one blob, they twisted it to paint Poland as an aggressor, just like them, trying to undermine trust between Ukraine and its key ally.
Okay. Now, while a full Russian invasion of Poland seems unlikely right now, that risk of NATO getting dragged in via a smaller incident is real, especially around the Suwalki Gap. Explain that bottleneck.
Yeah, that's the much more plausible and frankly terrifying scenario for NATO and Poland. Not a full invasion of Poland, but maybe a Russian move into a Baltic state, Lithuania, perhaps testing NATO's Article 5 resolve.
And the Suwalki Gap is key because
it's that narrow land corridor, only about 65 kilometers wide, connecting Poland to Lithuania. It's the only land route between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO.
And it's vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable. It's right next to Kaliningrad, Russia's heavily armed exclave on the Baltic. Russia has advanced area denial missile systems, their S-400s, Iskanders that could potentially seal off the gap, cutting the Baltics off from reinforcement.
So if Russia did move into the Baltics and NATO wanted to help,
Poland, to open that corridor and reinforce the Baltics, would likely need to attack those Russian missile systems in Kaliningrad. on Russian territory.
That's if required.
U.S. and NATO approval. A direct NATO attack on Russia, risking massive escalation, potentially nuclear. The alternative. Poland goes it alone and gets crushed. Or NATO abandons the Baltics, shattering the alliance. It's an incredibly dangerous flashpoint.
An extremely high-stakes bottleneck. Which leads us right back to the core argument of this deep dive. Russia's preference for a controlled collapse in Ukraine versus the risks of a chaotic one. What's the goal in that controlled scenario?
The argument from these sources is that Russia's aim isn't necessarily indefinite occupation of all Ukraine. It's more about inducing a systemic breakdown, a controlled collapse of the current Ukrainian government and military.
To achieve what?
To allow for the installation of a new, compliant government in Kyiv. One that's politically friendly to Moscow, neutral towards NATO.
And they prefer this controlled version specifically to avoid
a chaotic alternative. A messy breakdown, power vacuum, widespread internal fighting. That's the scenario that might directly invite NATO intervention, which Russia desperately wants to prevent.
It sounds like their old military doctrine, deep battle.
It resonates with that, yes. Deep battle wasn't about one knockout punch, but multiple operations to cause catastrophic failure in the enemy's defensive system. Systemic breakdown, allowing you to overrun territory before they recover. It's about inducing collapse, not just winning battles.
And the implication of a chaotic collapse is crystal clear: direct conflict with NATO, something they say they want to avoid, yet their actions might risk it.
That's the inherent danger. Chaotic collapse may be leading to Polish intervention in the West or a broader NATO response via Suwalki. That could trigger the direct Russia-NATO confrontation they claim to fear.
So the controlled collapse is seen as the path to victory with, in their eyes, manageable risk.
That seems to be the strategic calculus described. Controlled collapse achieves the objectives. Chaotic collapse brings unpredictable, potentially catastrophic escalation.
Now, many in the West have speculated about Russia itself collapsing under the strain sanctions casualties descent. Do our sources buy that idea? Is Russia on the verge of breaking up?
While those predictions exist, the overwhelming view in the sources we looked at is that Russia is here to stay. It won't collapse or break up in a massive way anytime soon.
Why not? What holds it together?
The prevailing view, especially within Russia's elite, is that the government is actually very stable because the key power players remain loyal.
The Siloviki, the security guys, oligarchs.
Yes, the security circles, the oligarchs benefiting from the system, even institutions like the Russian Orthodox Church. They form a powerful, centralized structure loyal to the Kremlin that resists fragmentation despite the war's costs and external pressure.
So even with the crisis, there's this kind of paradox of optimism inside Russia.
Exactly. That's a phrase used in the sources. Public opinion polls consistently show stable support for the war, around 70-75%, despite the challenges.
Even if people don't agree on all the specific war aims, like denazification.
Right. There might be disagreement on the specifics, the justifications like denazification, which really just means regime change, but there seems to be broad support for the conflict framed as a necessary, justified response to the outside threat, an existential challenge to Russia.
And that internal stability, real or perceived, allows them to keep pursuing these long-term goals, like the controlled collapse.
It gives them the confidence, yes. And this perceived internal consensus might be something the West fundamentally misunderstands, leading to those persistent misreads of Russian motives we talked about.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've explored this argument that Russia's actions aren't random, but part of a calculated strategy resetting deterrence in what they see as a changing world.
Right. We've looked at how their industry and economy adapted to fuel a long war, defying some early expectations.
And we analyzed that really dangerous geopolitical tightrope, Ukraine's potential collapse, and Russia's apparent preference for a controlled outcome versus the huge risks of chaos pulling NATO in.
And understanding that strategic layer, seeing it as calculation, not just emotion, gives you, the listener, a much more informed way to think about it.
It helps clarify the real stakes, the complex motivations, and maybe why some Western analyses might miss the mark if they ignore this strategic depth.
It really shifts the lens, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Beyond simple good versus evil into this complex clash of geopolitical strategies.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe unsettling thought. If one side in a conflict consistently misreads the fundamental motivations of the other, if those costly signals we talked about are dismissed as bluffs or just emotional noise instead of strategic warnings, then what signals are actually left? What can possibly communicate seriousness and prevent further, perhaps truly disproportional escalation down the line?